afternoon, everybody, and welcome back after that fantastic conversation. So we're going to do our best to have a smooth and energetic transition here. This is the first of what looks like several workforce-focused panels, so I'm excited for us to be kicking that off. My name is Maria Flynn. I'm the CEO of Jobs for the Future. And Carter talked a bit about the origin story of organizations, and so I'll use 1 minute of our origin story to kind of kick off our discussion. We were founded in 1983 by an executive named Arthur White, who was a partner at Yankelovich, Skelly and White, which is a marketing firm. And he was nearing the end of his career and became fascinated with this idea that states and governors were not keeping pace with the changing skills needs of their workforce. So that was 1983. We've been through a lot since then. Arthur passed away about 5 years ago at the age of 90, and I often think that he would be fascinated by the world that we're living in now and the role that technology is playing kind of in these issues. And so we have been about the future of work for 37 years, and it has been exciting to see how this topic has become more and more at the center of things in the past few years. And in my long history on these issues, I have been particularly excited in the past 3 to 5 years to see how corporations are truly stepping up in new and different ways, in ways that we have really never seen before. And so I think we're going to start to dig into that today. We have a great panel. And I'm going to ask each of them just to do a quick introduction and to let us know kind of how do they come to this issue? What's kind of their role in this ecosystem? Because the overall topic is managing for the future with workforce turbulence of today. So Ardeen, why don't we start with you?
Great, thank you. So Ardeen Williams, I lead workforce development for Amazon. And as the second largest employer in the US, we have 750,000 worldwide, about 400,000 employees in the United States. We believe that we have a role to play in creating good jobs. And good jobs comprise 3 things: good pay, $15 an hour minimum, robust benefits for full-time workers from day one, and a path to a career. And for the majority of our workers, that means taking the job that they're in, adding just-in-time skills and training to it, and then training them for another job, whether that's a vertical or horizontal or diagonal. And for the vast majority of our workers, that means that we are training them for a job outside the company that is available in the local community, that pays more than we do, that offers that entree to a career. And so the 3 things that are the challenge for us is identifying that pathway, overcoming the friction or removing friction for adult learners. And then the third is helping them make that effective transition to that new employer so that they've got that bottom rung on the career ladder and we're moving them up the wage scale outside our company.
Great. Michael.
Thanks. My name's Mike Rosenbaum. I'm the founder and executive chair of a company called Catalyte. That's built on technology that was originally designed to predict the likelihood that someone would be in the top 2% of all software engineers once they receive training. That business today is critical mass. It's a couple $100 million in revenue and about 800 full-time folks. One of the most interesting things about that business is it doesn't rely on resumes to make predictions. And the median income of someone prior to be identified as someone who will be in the top 2% of all software engineers is $25,000 a year. Median income 5 years later is $98,000 a year. I also am the chair and CEO of a company called Arena that I had spun out of Catalyte a few years ago that predicts the likelihood that an individual will achieve an outcome in a particular role under a particular manager on a particular shift in a particular location. It's deployed primarily into healthcare and also a little bit into hospitality and restaurants. And today it's deployed into organizations whose applicants are about 13% of the US healthcare workforce. And it's sort of at its core, it's attacking implicit bias based on race, class, and gender in hiring. But at a higher level, the problems it's solving are really that individuals aren't great at hiring folks. And also individual job applicants or participants in education don't always know where they're going to be happy and thrive. And so Arena is sort of at the core of trying to address that set of issues. And sort of how I came to it I'll just say where I sit in this ecosystem. I've been doing this work for a long time. Actually, going back to, I worked for Julius Stiglitz's dad 25 years ago. But where we sit in the ecosystem is really the idea that AI and machine learning create an opportunity to make predictions. And with those predictions that we can solve a lot of the informational asymmetry problems that cause mismatches in the broader workforce and education ecosystem. And that if we can sort of do that at scale, that we can have a meaningful impact on the way that folks move into higher and higher earning and frankly, also more and more satisfying jobs.
Great. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Beth Kleimer. I'm the CFO of Jobcase, which is a website and online community for workers to manage their work life that's particularly focused on the frontline workers, so the 80% of the population that's not well served by LinkedIn. Think people that work in retail, drive trucks, call centers, et cetera. We have created a community where people can come and find the advice and emotional support they need to navigate their work life with about 25 million monthly active unique users on our site. I joined Jobcase a year ago after spending the last decade of my career in Bain Capital, a private equity firm, helping scale large consumer retail businesses. So I come at this issue from a place of fundamental belief that capitalism is the unit of change to help us address all of the issues that our workforce, particularly our frontline workforce, both domestically and globally, have today.
Great. And Neil.
Hi everyone, I'm Neil Frye. I'm the Chief People Officer at Alto Pharmacy. We help medicine fulfill its true purpose. Prior to this, I spent several years at Dropbox, and then prior to that, Google and Accenture. And so my place in the ecosystem kind of has two hats. One, I also serve as a strategic advisory partner to GSV and helping them to look at solutions for their Accelerate fund. So I'm out in the marketplace looking for solutions that help tackle all the problems that we're talking about. And then I try to use them in my role as the CPO. In terms of kind of the challenge today, I'm trying to take all that I've learned over those many fortunate companies that I've worked with and apply it now to a company that's about 400 people but wants to scale very rapidly across the country to fulfill this mission that we have. And in a smaller company, in a smaller set of an organization, it's challenging because there's a lot of solutions out there and there's a lot of ideas about how to go solve it. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion and hearing from others and debating a bit.
Great. So we're going to start at the macro level with Beth. As she said, she's very interested kind of in this intersection of capitalism and opportunity, which I think is awesome. And I loved what Carter said around corporate boards and how they should focus on board diversity and sustainability. But I guess my question is, what about workforce and that and kind of impact on workers?
I wanted to give Carter a hug during his presentation because what he described that has already happened in the world of corporate sustainability is exactly what needs to happen on issues related to workforce. So maybe I'll start with just some data, an opinion, and maybe an action or two. So the data, Michael shared some really compelling data in his opening statements today about the one that I had not seen before that was most wow, was that in 2000, only 4 states had more than 50% of families under the poverty line, and 20 years later, that number was 20 states. Well, what else happened in that 20 years? GDP per capita is up 50%. S&P 500 revenue is almost doubled. S&P 500 earnings has more than doubled, and S&P 500 stock index is up like triple, right? So how do we square that circle? And by the way, I don't have the stats on what's happened to CEO pay, but we know that that's over here and the capitalism working for some and not for others. But I have an opinion, which is the same opinion as Carter's, not just because he's another Princeton person. I'm just a fundamental optimist that I believe that corporate leaders, CEOs, senior executives, and board members want to do the right thing. And I believe that presented with the right data, they can do the right thing. And so the prescription I often offer to CEOs, to investors, to my former colleagues in the private equity ecosystem is take 30 minutes at one board meeting a year. It's not that hard to talk about the issues facing your workforce, but particularly your frontline workforce, right? A lot of companies have succession planning conversations about their rock star talent, but not necessarily the conversations to say, what % of our workforce earn a living wage? It doesn't have to be 100, but you should at least know what the answer is. And for those who don't earn a living wage, what pathways do you offer, like what Ardeen described, to get them there? When do they get their schedules? Because if they get their schedule on a Wednesday for a week that starts on a Friday, it's really darn hard to plan childcare. How are the policies that you have that are the things that drove your revenue and your earnings and your stock price up, how are they impacting your workers' lives? And I just fundamentally believe if people know that information, they will make better decisions. The second thing that I think will allow people to make better decisions is by enabling capitalism and consumer behavior toward the people who do that right. So I'll tell you about 2 different airlines. You may all have to change your flights home after you hear this story. So last year, Delta and United both returned $3.5 billion in the form of shareholder buybacks and profit sharing as a pool. Delta gave 1/3 of that to their workers in the form of profit sharing, and the other 2/3 to their shareholders. And United gave 15%, so basically half that amount to their workers and the rest to the shareholders. So everyone's talking about shareholders and not stakeholders. That's an example of a business choosing to reward what we at Jobcase call the share makers just a bit more. The actual, I didn't do the math on what the dollars per share difference is of that buyback. It's not material, right? And so you have a comparison like that. Well, that's lovely, and hopefully it helps them have better employee retention at Delta and all that. But at the end of the day, if people start buying their flights from Delta, that's when CEOs stand back and take notice. And if United says, oh shit, we lost sales, sorry, I shouldn't swear. Lost sales because of that. We swear a lot in Cambridge. We lost sales because of that. Then all of a sudden the balance shifts. And so part of what we're trying to do at Jobcase, and we got a lot of work to do on it, is create forms in which you can kind of reward the good and peer pressure the bad. This is not the unions throw the rocks through the window, destroy the bad, but just peer pressure folks to behave a little better. And my fundamental optimist believes that can make the world a better place.
Awesome. And so, Ardeen, we're going to go to you. So next we'll go to a employer that is already obviously working at quite some scale. I grew up at a small town outside of Trenton, New Jersey, Robbinsville, and they just built a huge Amazon distribution center there, and has changed the town and the traffic patterns around the town for sure. My 90-year-old parents will tell you all about that, even though they shouldn't be driving. But when we first met, I think 2 years ago, and you were telling me about the career choice program, I was just blown away. I had really never heard of something which so innovative and such a large scale, what you're rolling out. And so maybe just update us on how is Amazon thinking about training your workforce, upskilling them, and as you said, even thinking about what are those job paths outside of Amazon.
So the company, so in July we made a public commitment to invest $700 million to upskill 100,000 employees. The largest program in that is Career Choice. And again, it's a first dollar program focused on our hourly associates. We don't offer tuition assistance for our salaried employees. And this program is not really focused on tuition assistance, but rather helping to create that pathway. And the challenge in it is really, and you heard a lot of it earlier, what's the right pathway? How to identify those in-demand jobs in the local community, because a lot of the data is rearward looking. But what we do know is that in communities like Dallas-Fort Worth, for example, where 1 in 6 jobs is in aerospace, that if in fact we build a pipeline of advanced manufacturing technicians, there's a clear path for those employees. And once, by putting the classes on site, it makes it far easier for employees, because I don't know about you, when I went to school, my night classes, I had my absolute worst attendance, because once I went home, it was really hard to go back to school. So by putting those classrooms on site, it helps make it easier. And then the classrooms are a fishbowl. So you walk by and say, well, geez, if Ardeen is doing that, I can do it. And then when I transition out to a new job, you've got that hand that says, hey, come on, this is a good place to be. And so it really is that opportunity to create that ecosystem to move people. But it's identifying those pathways is probably the biggest challenge that we have.
Yeah. And so how do you think about engaging local partners to do that then in those regions?
It varies by location. We have good partners in not-for-profit, for-profit, community college. It's a broad range, but it's really the conveners, I think, that help. It's via trade industries, for example, because they know where jobs are going unfilled. In Washington State, Career Connect Washington is very powerful for us because it helped marry us up with Dignity Health. So we do the pre-apprenticeship program, and then our employees move over to that.
That's great. And then in our prep call, you said something really interesting about how kind of careers have gone from, a game of checkers to a game of three-dimensional chess, I think.
Actually, that's about so that was really about one of the things that I wrestle with, and this is across the broader workforce, is this definition of an employee.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a narrative that the gig worker is something new, and it really isn't. I mean, the manpower played a big role in developing that workforce. But if you think about the definition of a W-2 employee and a 1099, the fundamental pieces are portability of benefits, or giving benefits, which is an outcome of World War II and the fact that wages were frozen and employers added benefits to be able to hire. And then the First Depression, which created a social safety net. Those are two very unrelated events, and yet we cling to them as if we created a definition of an employee via chess. Mm-hmm. And it was probably closer to tic-tac-toe. But then you take a step back and say, okay, what do we have to do to fairly fund the social safety net? Right? How do you not have such a unbalanced contribution where a contract worker is making the entire contribution? And then how do we truly create portable benefits? The ACA is a great start, but it certainly isn't the answer, because it's very difficult as an employer so that even if you choose to want to make that available, it's impossible.
For sure.
And I think so for me, that's the comment, is structurally, we need to take a step back and think about it.
Absolutely. I feel, in so many ways, our benefit systems, the training systems, so much of what our country is operating on are, built in the New Deal or, before.
Piecemeal,
in some ways,
right?
yeah.
Well, even just treating employees and contractors as different, kind of classes to a certain extent. And how do we start to break those down? I think, 3 to 5 years ago, we started talking about onboarding them similarly, sharing our mission and values, inviting them to more meetings. Like, those were all very first steps, and now we really need to take, the next steps in that to really, truly provide both the opportunity and living wage and benefits to those same folks, because they're all contributing to our outcomes.
And the policy and the jurisdiction has to catch up with it.
Yeah. And so Neil, so you're, as you said, a company with 400 employees really looking to scale rapidly.
Yes.
And so what are your biggest pain points in that process, and what kind of solutions are you using, or you wish that you had to use?
Yeah, so I'm in month 3, so no pressure. I think first and foremost is hiring, absolutely right. And for us, it's the diversity of roles. I'm trying to fill pharmacists and pharmacy techs, fulfillment folks, and software engineers and product managers and designers. So it is a broad range of individuals, not unlike Amazon and some others. But certainly, trying to find the right sources for those talent, provide my teams the right tools, assess them in a fair and unbiased way. All of those are huge challenges that we'll face. Second then is around development. We're in a space, and part of our value proposition is convenience, and we're trying to get medicine and drive adherence to taking that medicine through delivery. And that delivery mechanism today is through cars and bikes, and those may go away very soon. So how do I not staff up an entire organization that is filled with people that eventually an autonomous vehicle delivers? And then third is pay. Back to the number of individuals at our company that are hourly and paid bi-weekly, that rely on that check every week, and paying them a week in arrears oftentimes is challenging, particularly the first paycheck. And how do we just break that mold that we have, that it takes so long to go from Friday of the pay period end to the Friday pay payday. So all of those things I really, I'm interviewing payroll managers now and trying to talk to them about, what are innovative things that we can think about to break these molds and really change how we service employees and help them do their best.
And Michael, the companies that you have been involved with, really are doing interesting work around helping individuals get into opportunities that are maybe wouldn't have been the normal or kind of obvious course for them. So maybe talk a bit about that. What have you learned through that process, and kind of what excites you the most about the future of that kind of work?
Sure. So Catalyte's really focused on tech, and over the years that I've done that business, that sort of the interest in tech has grown massively, obviously since I first started that business a long time ago. But there's a relatively small percentage of folks we find who are both going to love being a software engineer and are really fabulous at it. And that individual may come from anywhere. So 50% of folks don't have anything in college. The demographics of each geography look almost exactly like the metro areas in which we operate. But it's a relatively small sliver of the world. For Arena, there are a really interesting set of questions around how folks find where they're going to thrive. And so one of the things that Arena does is it's typically deployed into an employer to solve this problem of folks making decisions about who should be in which job and where. But obviously there's this secondary issue of folks not knowing where they're going to thrive. And we started doing it at a pretty micro level. We started working with nursing schools that were putting nurse residents into hospitals. And the nurse resident would say, I want to work in the ED because I have a friend who works there. And there was actually a little bit of a class correlation. If someone grew up in a family where they knew a lot of nurses, it was a little easier. Whereas if someone didn't know any nurses in their family, then they were more likely to just go with wherever their friends were. And that person may or may not be likely to thrive in the ED, but may be more likely to thrive in maternity. And so routing folks from a nursing school into the particular place where they're going to be happy. And now we're doing it at a slightly larger scale. There's some interesting dynamics in some of the markets Arena operates in. So 75% of certified nursing assistants in the United States who leave a job take a job outside of healthcare. And so it's a pretty high percentage, but the issue is that a lot of the jobs that folks take end up causing some issues like what you're talking about, Arlene, which is folks will work, they may make a little bit more at the very beginning working at, Amazon or a number of other places, but 3 years in, there's no upward trajectory. And in fact, if that person went back into some other industry, like healthcare, senior living, skilled nursing, that person actually would make relevantly more. And so the question is, how can you route people appropriately? And so what we've started to do is to identify folks who are being rejected from certain clients, who the client is okay handing us, and then figuring out where that person in the rest of our client base would be likely to thrive. And so, for example, someone who is rejected from a fast food restaurant, but would actually be fabulous as a caregiver in a senior living building. And that person may never even heard of the senior living industry, but I know this doesn't sound sexy, senior living, but it's an important industry and an increasingly important industry, and routing that person into that job where they're going to actually make something almost twice as much, but also be happier. And as a result, we've started to do work with organized labor around taking folks who are in different organized labor membership groups and putting them onto our platform to identify where that person will be likely to thrive, because the leadership of the unions is saying that the future of organized labor may or may not be in conflict with management. It actually might be in providing value and happiness and career pathways to our members, and that's really where we're going to provide value going forward.
A question on that, because I know before lunch, I think it was the CEO of Kaplan said, people will do what it takes to get the next job. And the concern I have with that statement is I feel that most people don't know what that is. I was curious what you all think about that. Because I think, to me, that's probably the biggest issue we have in this country is the kind of the lack of information. I love the union example as one solution to that. But just any thoughts? How do we help people
build a really great website? But in seriousness, this was the biggest unmet need that Jobcase was designed to solve, and by no means have we solved it. I love, Ardeen, some of the narratives you described about what's happening when people see their peers engaging in these career pathing, because there's a massive confidence gap.
Yeah.
Many of us were lucky, many people in this room were lucky enough to grow up in families where you were told you can do everything. And you still, I would assume, feel unconfident sometimes. And so imagine if you didn't have that kind of support, or you don't have that kind of support because for the last decade you've been paycheck to paycheck and your marriage fell apart, it's so stressful, right? You're in these deep moments of vulnerability. So the idea of, I'd be curious to know when you identify someone who got rejected from the fast food job they got their guts up to apply for, how do you help them? Because a lot of what we see on our platform is people saying like, I don't know, I don't want to be a cashier anymore, but I don't know what else to do. And the minute a former cashier weighs in and said, I found a job at a local nursing home, then the excitement is there. But there's, I feel like, more systemic things that can do
It's also the what does a day in the life look like, right? When we started, advanced manufacturing, I didn't know what advanced manufacturing technicians did. I had to go see what it was. And so that's the other piece, is how do we help with that discovery? Because we know in other programs when people fall out or quit, it's because wow, this isn't what I signed up for. And so providing that preview is hugely important. Yeah. What does a day in the life look like?
Yeah. It's critically important. And so interestingly, at Catalyte, when Circuit City was open, some of you will know what I'm talking about when I say that. So when Circuit City was open, 10% of Catalyte's workforce had a prior job as a cashier at Circuit City. Wow. And so, or not just workforce, but also folks who identified and deployed to a client. Super interesting, right? And that's a question of someone who maybe had a little bit of exposure to tech and electronics and was interested in, and sort of in the course of doing that job, they found that. But one of the things that we found, exactly as you're finding, is that on the arena side, when we identify someone who's been rejected from a fast food restaurant, how do you help that person know about that other job? Yeah. And in particular, one of the really nitty-gritty problems is how do you help that person learn about that other job in a way that isn't too disruptive to the employer on the other side, right? Because if the reality is that you route some person into this job and the employer says, oh, this is great, there's a person, and the person says, I'm interested, and then they never reply. It's an incredible burden on, frankly, the talent acquisition function of the other organization. And so what we started to do is to roll out predictions of the likelihood that someone will respond to information. And it's incredibly important, frankly, to make it easier for the talent acquisition function. But I also think that in the next year or so, it's going to give us the opportunity to figure out what information does someone need to really know what that job is. I thought I was going to be serving at a Taco Bell, but I'm really going to care for folks with memory care issues. That's a totally different day in the life. Right?
Yeah, well,
totally different. I mean, maybe. Right? But totally different day of the life. And so the question is sort of what information do you need to provide and when and how do you do it? And the ability to solve these informational problems with technology is what we are doing, what I'm doing, what lots of us are doing around sort of the use of technology to solve these informational problems. Is what gives us the opportunity to use a scalpel to figure out that problem and intervene.
I mean, I think it's a combination of the kind of talent communities that we're talking about, the information and education that you're talking about, and then the last piece to me is the upskilling and enabling them to understand what the gap is. At Dropbox, we were leveraging a solution that allowed us to, drop folks who were dispositioned from our jobs, and then they had access to the other jobs. But what they didn't have was a way to close the gap. And so, again, I think we're all chasing after some of these solutions. The only other challenge I'll pose is that, again, the types of roles, the industry roles, we all have made it very hard for providers, partners to solve this problem. I continue to believe that a somewhat unified taxonomy of skills is a pretty big problem that some group of us need to go and try to solve, because we all just end up using the same words to describe things, and that's half of why people don't know what they don't know what they need to do in order to close the gap to become employable.
That's a really important point, because it also comes back to this concept of stackable credentials and knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we had the earlier example about the Cisco certs. It took decades for those Cisco industry certifications to become de facto standard.
Absolutely.
And so, okay, there's millions of boot camps, there's lots of certificates. How do I, as an employer, know, short of that degree, that's an indicator that you are skilled in that? And so I think that figuring out how we get to that stamp of approval that says, yes, these are KSAs and you've got them, would make it a lot easier on talent acquisition.
I think one of the other challenges, I mean, not to make the problem bigger, but one of the challenges, we're already talking pretty big, but I think what we found in our data sets over time is that asking an employer what skills they're looking for doesn't work.
Yeah, that's true.
Sorry.
No, I was thinking about it because the Greater Washington Partnership's tackling that,
Yeah,
right?
it's trying to tackle that, but the problem is that how do I as an employer know 5 years from now
You don't.
what I'm going to need, right? And I can guess, but I'm going to be super susceptible to, frankly, the skills of my hiring managers in identifying that. You know, we actually ran some experiments in hospitals where we would ask managers to rank their staff into quartiles and tell us what they were looking for. And then we would go back to the same managers and ask them to rank the exact same people again after 45 days. Totally different rankings. I mean, 45 days, totally different rankings. And so that's an extreme example. I mean, no one suggests that healthcare is perfectly run. But that set of issues is incredibly challenging. And so the ability to tie to the actual business outcomes, whatever that business outcome is, and the ability of technology actually to leverage that in a way that allows us to process a lot more information than we each can as individuals, I think creates a big opportunity to do something there.
Yeah, and that 5-year horizon is huge. And then you look at the turnaround time in higher ed to assess it, particularly in a 4-year institution, it starts to become intractable.
So I want to be sure our house whips have a few minutes. So we have Murray Goldberg, who's the founder and CEO of Marine Learning Systems, and Pierre Dubuc, who's the co-founder and CEO of OpenClassrooms. You guys have questions or?
Well, Pierre and I talked about it. We're hoping to be completely superfluous, actually. I mean, it's much more fun if you guys ask the questions, so start thinking about them. We take no particular pleasure in whipping people, but make no mistake, we will whip. Pierre actually just said he'll whip anything that needs to be whipped.
Okay.
I mean, he didn't say I could share that, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I have a question already. So mostly we're just going to throw mics around if that's all right.
So I'm Matthew Raskoff. I work at Duke University. And so this is a question about how institutions, not just institutions like Duke, but any institution that runs a career services operation should be thinking about how we should be changing our practices in order to keep up with the way that industry is thinking about it. I see in my work with our students, they have some of the same challenges that you face, where there's a great narrowing of their ambitions and their sense of possibility. They write on their applications to college that they want to be astronauts and they want to go to Mars. And then they graduate and they go into the career world and it's like consulting, banking, consulting. And there's this like incredible narrowing that happens in what we thought was this expansive liberal arts education that's doing kind of the opposite in some ways because of the herd effects, the fishbowl effects you talked about. So what are some progressive ways of thinking about the future of career services and how we can relate to industry more effectively?
So can I tackle that one as a former consultant?
So you're not alone.
And also, I would say patience. We have to start teaching people more patience, because I think that going into consulting can lead you to Mars, but it may not be the first step. And I think to a certain extent we've set unrealistic expectations for people.
I was struck in the discussion this morning that there was, the word employer wasn't mentioned all that often. And I think one of the panels was named something like being more consumer-centric in education. There are actually two end customers of education. There's the student who becomes the worker, and there's the employer who not just gives them the first job, but the lifetime of employment that hopefully follows. And I think just this whole thesis of what does that partnership look like, and how do all types of institutions, elite institutions, community colleges, et cetera, find those partnerships, which requires the employers to do a better job of articulating what their needs are, which to your point is not easy, and the education organizations to do a good job of saying, okay, well, how can we actually innovate and redesign our curriculum to meet those needs? Because if you don't think about both end customers, I think it's hard to imagine a world in which we truly solve this problem.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Mike bias.
Hey, Colin Brown. Very impressed about the Amazon program, so really good to hear about it in more detail, so thanks for that. Just a quick question. Can you tell me or name any non-US entities, companies, governments, entities that you feel is doing a very good job in this space? Because there's a lot of good practice globally. we haven't had quite enough of the kind of outside world yet?
So Career Choice is a global program, as is our apprenticeship program. Different certifying bodies in the US, we use DOL. In the UK, it's a different entity. But it is tailored individually by country because it's important, again, that you're training people for the jobs that are available where they are.
Great, well, I think we're going to.
Yeah, I can throw a couple in again. Some of these are somewhat dated references, but if you're referencing, managing a workforce and trying to think about the future challenges that are coming down the pike, again, I had the fortune of consulting to Nike and AB InBev and Heineken, and all three of those companies had fairly innovative, even for, again, those were a few years ago, whether they were apprenticeship programs, thinking about how sustainability was going to ultimately drive operations and automation in ways of making sure that their workforce, would continue to have a role inside the organization or somewhere else, whether it was inside the company or not, to keep employee engagement and continue to keep their brand where it needed to be for an employment perspective.
My exposure is mostly to tech on that front, because Arena is really almost entirely domestic. But frankly, the Nike story is an important one. So Nike is the company that put Catalyte on the map. Nike was the first adopter to use Catalyte to build out its workforce, to build out a piece of wearable technology called the Fuel Band, and used alternative hiring. And they were sort of forced to do it because I don't think they had the capacity otherwise. But frankly, they did that work, not just in the U.S. And I think that was a really important piece of it. The other piece is that when we look at other countries and the sort of structure of those other countries, we're finding there's certain non-governmental entities in certain other countries. There's an entity called Tech Nation in the UK that's really interesting, that's doing some interesting things with workforce and is really being sort of out front on some really progressive ideas, in part because of just a capacity issue on software engineering capacity as a driver of innovation in the UK as a whole. There's some really interesting things going on in Scandinavia as well. And actually, I know this sounds super bizarre, there's some interesting innovators in frankly, Malaysia around this topic, and around the idea of, again, sort of how does a place like Malaysia build out a tech workforce that can support its own domestic innovation ecosystem.
So I think I'm going to have to wrap us up, getting the high sign over here. So I want to thank our panelists, and I know the next few panels are going to carry on a lot of these themes. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.